there was no doubt in my mind that part of the appeal of Blair was precisely his drag queen kind of persona. That
How's the drag?
smile,
What's the drag queen persona of Blair?
that smile. You must remember the
Yeah, yeah,
'90s. He
yeah,
had this and the eyes, and it was a kind of glamorous, but because he was channeling Thatcher to
yeah,
some degree, and
yeah.
um, and he did have a drag queen kind of charisma to him, which I mean, he didn't have the any of the ribald humor,
Or
but
indeed the honesty.
exactly, yeah, quite the opposite. But he had a kind of glamorousness to him, which was unsettling.
Hello, welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga, but gay. It's Thursday, the 4th of March. My name is Alex Hochuli, and if you like bringing close proximity genitals which are nearly identical, then this is the episode for you. Hi, Phil and George. We're here to talk about...
That is the weirdest introduction we've had in nearly like 170 episodes, and all the weirder for being spoken so closely into the mic.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say. We should have an introduction of that quality every single episode.
Indeed.
So we were talking about why the gays have sold out, I think, which sounds like we are sitting on our high horse telling people how they shouldn't pursue their politics. But
that's what we normally do, right?
The view is good from up on the high horse, on the moral high ground. It's Absolutely. A good view.
But we've got two guests coming on so it's not just us on the high horse. We've got guests, maybe, I don't know how high their horses are. I guess we'll find out soon enough. We got Mark Simpson, who's a British cultural commentator, and also River Page, who'll be joining us from the States and is one of the contributing editors to Twink Rev, an up-and-coming podcast. So...
Yeah, I mean, we were, George and I, laughing when you said how high their horse is, because, of course, the other question is how hung their horse is. Well, we started this off on the right foot, but we should probably stop us three and bring in the guests.
Okay, welcome. So we've got Mark Simpson, author and journalist, and we've got River Page, who's contributing editor at twinkrev.com. Hi, River. Hi, Mark, and welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hello, thank you very much for having me too.
So we're here to talk about sexual politics, sexual freedom, and gay liberation today. And identity politics is one of the themes we keep returning to on this pod. And in many ways, gay politics is the quintessential original form of identity politics. But before we do that, before we get stuck into that, let's get to know our guests a little bit. So if we start with you, River, we said you're one of the contributing editors to twinkrev.com. Can you tell us a little bit about what TwinkRev is? What's it about?
So TwinkRev started off as a podcast. It's not my podcast. It's run by Sam and Gian. It's lovely. And they at some point around this time last year decided that they were going to spin off a little online magazine. And I just had like 80 followers on Twitter or something, and like made a joke about writing an essay about polyamory and neoliberalism or something like that, and they were like, we'll pay you to write this. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll do it. And so I did. And then a bunch of other people started writing for them. And it's kind of taken a life of its own. It kind of has like a different audience than even the podcast does. It's kind of strange, but we're going to actually be rebranding sometime soon. So you might see our publications under like a different name and stuff like that, but we'll still be there.
River, you're based in Florida, in the Panhandle part of the Sunshine State, as you were saying earlier. So while we have you on, could you perhaps provide some insight to our listeners about one of the ostensible paradoxes of politics in your state? And this is Florida hitting the headlines over the last few years. First, for voting to emancipate its former felons by restoring their political rights to them once they were freed from jail, and more recently, voting for $15 minimum wage, and then subsequently plumping for Trump in the presidential election last year. So could maybe tell us a little bit, is this a case of Trumpists who support a high minimum wage and the extension of political rights? What's the political makeup of the state like?
Well, it's sort of known as like the sort of quintessential purple state, or at least has been for like the past couple of decades, but it is definitely becoming more red, but it's not a conservative place. I mean, even where I live, which is, the most conservative part of the state, Matt Gaetz, who's like a big Trump guy, is our congressman. It's the Deep South. And like, I don't worry about being like an openly gay person here. I mean, it's not, social conservatism is not quite as prevalent here as it is in the rest of the South. But there is a sort of like rabid anti-communism that comes out of like South Florida and stuff like that because of, well, one, the Cubans, but then after the pink tide in South America, a lot of like professional class people from South America, from Venezuela, Ecuador, places like that, started moving to Miami and surrounding areas as well. So you kind of have like, it skews Republican, but that being said, I mean, it's a service economy state. Tourism is the primary industry where I live because it's right on the beach. You have a big tourism industry in Miami. Orlando is all tourism, Disneyland or Universal, all that. Yeah. And so people tend to work hourly wage jobs that, perhaps maybe don't pay very well. And so, I mean, if it's, something like a $15 minimum wage comes up, even if you're voting for Trump because you're paranoid about socialism, or because you, just feel fed up with, the Democratic Party because they're a party of excuses and they never really deliver on anything or whatever, then, I mean, I don't think people are completely ignorant of their material interests. So yeah, none of that is really surprising to me.
That makes sense. So Mark, and if we turn to you now, so one of your claims to fame was you coined the term metrosexual back in a 1994 article for the British newspaper, The Independent. So you're the daddy of the metrosexual, and we were wondering how you think your wayward son has fared since then. And also, what's the difference, if there is any, between a metrosexual and a metropolitan elitist?
Well, so many questions. On the subject of the last question first, so I don't forget it. The difference between a metrosexual and the metropolitan elite is that, well, there's several differences, but one would be that metropolitan elite isn't necessarily attractive. And quite the opposite often. You wouldn't want to shag most of them, I suspect. Might be wrong. And the other difference, which is more substantial, is that metrosexuality, contrary to many perceptions, including, of course, The Guardian, isn't a haute bourgeois preoccupation. In fact, if it has a class identity or class association, it's much more associated, or much more likely to be associated, with working class males.
Yeah.
And when I first wrote about metrosexuals in 1994, when I'd attended a GQ It's a Man's World exhibition, which was full of product, and moisturizer and fashion, but most importantly, lots of young men who were walking embodiments of what I was talking about, young men who exhibited a desire to be desired, which is, for me, not for most people who use the term metrosexuality, but for me, for what it's worth, has always been at the heart of it. The male desire to be desired and to be looked at. But the hub of metrosexuality, I argued, was actually not even London so much as somewhere like Newcastle, which, funnily enough, after this became a big thing in the early noughties, you got lots of newspapers and magazines asking me questions like The Guardian travel department saying, which is the most metrosexual city in Europe? And I knew they wanted me to say Stockholm or, maybe Milan, something like that. But instead, I said the truth, or what I perceived to be the truth, which was Newcastle. And that was years before Geordie Shore, decades before Geordie Shore ever happened. And the reason that I said it was because, as I said in the original article, 94 article, Independent, was that for a lot of working class young men, particularly post-80s, post-Thatcherism, post-skilled industrial jobs for life, they had to reinvent themselves for a very different marketplace and become, a brand of a sort. But particularly in Newcastle, it was already the case that, according to these surveys, I mean, I don't know how much value you can put on these surveys, but I did at the time for the sake of argument. Newcastle men supposedly, and I can believe it, spent more on shirts, on clothes, than any other city in Europe, males in a city in Europe. So this idea that metrosexuals are somehow bourgeois is not necessarily so. Quite the opposite, quite often. And of course, who became the exemplar of metrosexuality, the poster boy? David Beckham.
Yeah.
Because David Beckham, who is East London working class lad, before he became a millionaire footballer superstar, had that investment in being glamorous, which middle class people, properly middle class people, think is vulgar, especially in this country.
Yeah.
And they think it's even more vulgar in its second incarnation, its second generation manifestation, which is spornosexuality. Because that's not even just about having nice hair, nice skin, and nice clothes. It's about being a sexualized object. It's about fashioning your own body into a sexy commodity and displaying it. And you see lots of examples of Guardian types who absolutely despise that. Love Island, Geordie Shore. And it's a class hatred, as much as anything.
Yeah.
There are lots of spornosexuals who aren't working class, but it's much more of a working class phenomenon, particularly in this part of the world, and particularly in those parts of the world where there used to be a very strong, large working class that worked in heavy industries, and all they had was their bodies to sell, their labor. And that's gone for the most part. And now they work on their own bodies in gymnasia instead of factories, which some of them sell very profitably online.
Yeah.
Either on OnlyFans or as personal fitness trainers online on YouTube and what have you. So that's the difference between metrosexuals and spornosexuals is really a generational thing. 20 years after metrosexuality is born, in effect, in 94, 2014, the mid second decade of the 21st century, we have basically metrosexuality has become normal. And so what you have to do, you have to intensify the effect, and you have to be basically pornographic. Lots of ink, lots of pumped flesh, on display. The clothes are important, but they are really just a way of presenting the body. And as we
can I jump in here? Sorry,
yes,
Mark.
please do.
I mean, because I was curious. I mean, well, on one level, I probably should clarify, I guess, for non-British listeners, what kind of Newcastle is like as a city and what Geordie Shore is. Geordie Shore, of course, I think was the original before Jersey Shore was made. But anyway,
no, other way around.
Other way around, right? Okay,
yeah.
But same vibe there. But Newcastle, of course, is like the largest city in kind of the northeast of England, which is coal country. So you can, I guess, imagine kind of the class connotations of that. But I mean, I was also curious, maybe to hear from River whether he found a similar dynamic, I guess, in the US with regard to how metrosexuality relates to class.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear, but also to say, I definitely feel I've lost lots of metrosexual credentials, like in lockdown, and because just all standards have just collapsed. And so listeners obviously can't appreciate this. Our guest can see me at the moment, unshaven and looking kind of generally far less metrosexual and healthy than I normally do. But anyway, there you go. Yeah. Okay. So sorry, River. Yeah. What do you think about the how does metrosexuality and spornosexuality how does it go down in Florida? I guess there must be plenty of it because you guys are on the beach, right?
Yeah, you get a lot of that. I mean, if you go down to like any of like the nice sort of beach like restaurants or bars, you'll see like these like really ripped like guys, and they're just pretty kind of sells if you're working in like the service industry.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I've worked jobs before where like they like basically like if you were decent looking, like they would just hire you. But as to what like Mark was saying, I think it sort of got me thinking about like when I was growing up, because I grew up in a much more rural and conservative area that was in the process of deindustrialization, and I saw sort of what he was talking about, but in like a very specific subset of like working class young men that I kind of grew up around. But it was very much
this was in Texas,
in East Texas, right? Because like they would sort of like I think it was coming downstream from the broader culture, because you did have things like Jersey Shore and like the sort of like MTV like reality show sort of thing, and all of that. But then all of those guys now, they most of them still live like in my hometown, but they work 2 weeks on, 2 weeks on oil rigs and pipelines, and they just look like rednecks like everybody else does. And so it's kind of like, I think it was I just thought that was an interesting kind of maybe a difference, that seemed to be more of an urban phenomenon in the US than here.
Well, don't many gays in the US look like rednecks these days?
Some of them, yeah. Like I have a friend who.
Wait, you're proud of your redneck heritage, River?
I am.
Talk
yeah,
about it on Twitter.
Yeah, I have my little Carhartt jacket and stuff. Yeah, but yeah. Well, I mean, I tried to get away from that for a really long time, because it used to not. Now it's become like really fetishized, like the whole redneck thing. Yes. I have a friend named Matt Muck, who lives in Mississippi. And
Matt Muck is a big fan of Bunga Cast, so here's a shout out to Matt Muck.
Shout out, Matt. Yeah. He's the sweetest guy. Yeah, he comes down to Pensacola and we hang out all the time. He's great. But he has made like an entire career off, the whole redneck persona thing. And like, I don't think that could have happened 10 years ago. Because I remember when I was like 18, 19 and like just moved out of my like town of 700 people and like came here, like gay people were mean as fuck to me. Like they were like made fun of my accent. I had to get rid of that. I had to start like dressing nice. Like it was brutal. But now I think the culture's kind of sort of swung, because people look at someone like or gay guys anyway, they look at like somebody like Pete Buttigieg and they're just like, ugh. You know?
Yeah.
Well, that seems a fairly natural
Yeah,
reaction.
absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Actually, we've got. We're going to talk. We'll come back to Pete Buttigieg in due course, because he did come to mind when we were thinking about the kind of how the position of gays has changed, I guess, in the Western world. But before we get to him, I guess let's get stuck into the topic at hand. So, if we start with you, Mark, it's the 25th anniversary of the collection of essays that you published back in 1996 called Anti-Gay. So could you tell us a little bit about the book, its core arguments and the response to it, and perhaps what you think of it looking back a quarter of a century on?
Oh, yeah. Quarter of a century. Well, I took it off my dusty, my copy of the book, Anti-Gay, off the dusty bookshelf earlier today, and I honestly had forgotten just about everything in it, and including my own contributions. So I had to remind myself. But it did cause a bit of a stir at the time in '96 when it was published, and that was intentional. It was an incendiary volume, but it wasn't needlessly offensive. The offence was. Perhaps I should just read out some of the blurb first. Have you ever wondered to yourself in private why most gay culture these days is mediocre trash? Why so many lesbians have such a problem with long hair and dainty footwear? Why being gay is like being a member of a religious cult, except not so open-minded? What happens when a gay activist takes celebrating diversity seriously and sleeps with someone of the opposite sex? Whether the closet is perhaps not quite as awful a place as you've been led to believe, and whether you're the only homosexual in the world with these feelings. If you have, it's okay. You're not alone anymore. Anti-gay, the shameful antidote to prideful feel-good politics, will give you the strength to tell the world you're not glad to be gay after all.
That is pretty incendiary stuff.
Yes,
pretty punchy.
I don't know that you'd get away with any of this now.
No, you're cancelled already just for that.
Yes, I shouldn't have taken it off my shelf, really, should I? Only bad things can happen to me now. It's a collection. I only wrote a couple of things in it, and the other contributors include Bruce the Bruce, Gender Orgasm, John Weir, and Lisa Power, who I knew from my time on Switchboard, London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard in the 80s, back when I still had some milk of human kindness left. And her piece was about what happened when she slept with a male Switchboard volunteer, which, it didn't go down well at the time. Let's just put it that way. So, and Peter Tatchell's piece was called "It's Just a Phase: Why Homosexuality Is Doomed," and and there were people like Peter and Lisa and maybe one or two others weren't, they were gay libbers,
yeah,
who were already kind of out of fashion by 1996, obviously, because they were late sort of 70s, early 80s gay libbers. But the gay lib project from that era was already becoming a radical one again, compared to mainstream gay politics in the 90s.
Yeah.
Why I actually did this? Well, it was coming from this, basically it was really designed to piss off the gay press. That's what it was for.
Yeah.
And it worked perfectly. Gay Times reviewed it 3 times or denounced it 3 times. And somebody said to me, well, I think that Gay Times should change its title to anti-gay times. But they were an easy target, but that doesn't mean that they didn't deserve it.
Yeah.
And because the whole of the gay press in the early 90s to mid 90s was actually very powerful because the internet hadn't really happened.
Yeah.
It was almost all of it was paid for by gay businesses.
Yeah.
Bars, clubs, popper manufacturers or salespeople, all the rest of it. And so we had newspapers like in the UK, Boys and Capital Gay and the Pink Paper, which people sat in gay bars reading. And they all had the same line on everything, which was that being gay is great.
Yeah.
And you've got to go to gay bars and read gay newspapers and buy gay products because being gay is great, and also because straight people are nasty.
Yeah.
And of course, there was a business incentive in I'm not saying there wasn't some truth to the world that they were talking about. And of course, this is still in the this is just after the AIDS terror, should we call it? The AIDS epidemic. It's beginning to tail off in the mid 90s because of the heart drug success. But it's actually to put it in another context. There's a fantastic. I know you wanted to talk about It's a Sin at some point, possibly if there was time. But I happened across on YouTube a 1981 documentary from a series for LWT called Gay Life. And it's about the gay world in the early 80s and comparing it to the 1930s, because there's still people alive in the early 80s from the 1930s, and the whole kind of cruising world of trade from that era. And it's absolutely fascinating because it's a discussion which would be impossible now, because it's honest and it's simply descriptive. It's not ideological, and it's not emotional. And it's not about a narrative of victims and victimizers and all the rest of it. So even by the 90s, that was, let alone now, even by the 90s, that was no longer possible because the basically identity politics, American style, and the whole pride parade idea had become really dominant. And the whole gay lifestyle as well had been dominant. Although we didn't have any of the American gay ghettos at that time, really, that had driven that phenomenon in the US, but we sort of wanted it. So that was the world that it was coming out of. And yes, the gay papers and magazines hated it, which is fine. But interestingly, their readers loved it because it was the whole point of it. Really, it wasn't to come up with an alternative agenda or manifesto, but simply to talk about the things which you won't get discussed at that time in the gay press. Of course, again, as I say, now I think. Everything's relative, and now things are much, much worse in many ways. So you think, well, actually, what was I complaining about?
I mean, that takes us to the question, I suppose. So, I mean, I was thinking about the show. Just recently, I mean, I saw American embassies made a big show of running up the rainbow flag for gay pride. So American embassies all around the world. The Bank of England building in London was bathed in the colours of the trans flag to celebrate trans pride. GCHQ, which for our listeners outside the UK is the core of the surveillance state in the UK, It bathed itself in the gay pride colors, and it constantly flaunts its connection on social media to the famous codebreaker Alan Turing, who was committed suicide as a result of being prosecuted for his sexuality. So I guess the question, the basic question is, did the gays win? River and Mark, what do you think? Did the gays win? And connected to that, we'll come back to Pete Buttigieg, but I was going to ask, does anyone actually believe that Pete Buttigieg is actually gay? Mayor Pete, so Biden's new supposedly out transport secretary, is he maybe just still kind of get the feeling he might just be a kind of a straight guy who's pretending to be gay to get the gay points? Because he is so kind of
that sounds like a desperate rationalization.
It's quite possibly a desperate rationalization.
I understand, but I suspect we may have to own that one.
Probably. No, I'm sure your instincts are right on that. Did the gays win? What do you guys think? And if winning, what does winning mean, I suppose, in this context?
Well, I think that this book that I was talking about, Anti-Gay, published in '96, was really, it turns out, the beginning of the avalanche. I mean, not the book itself, but that era that it was lampooning was actually only just beginning to get underway. And the whole Rainbow flag, resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. Of course, it's you've got all the alphabet letters now. And we've got gay marriage. We've got gay MPs, gay everything now. So in a sense, everything that this book that I put out all those years ago was criticizing has just rolled over the culture. But it's in a sense it has almost nothing to do with quote unquote gays anymore, in the sense that it's so corporate. It's marketing, it's PR, it's the lifestyleism of, and the celebrate diversity aspect of 90s gayness that has been completely assimilated by corporate NATO war making in the most extraordinary kind of creepy fashion. Which on the one hand, well, that's great because lesbians and gays and trans people can be out, and they won't be sacked, and they can bomb foreign countries, illegally, and be out. I think that project has completely dissipated.
Let me bring River in. So what do you think, River? Have the gays won?
The gays have won, but in winning, they've completely destroyed anything that's gay. Like they've won by destroying gayness itself, or like allowing it to be transformed into something that can be used for power. There's still like holdouts. I think about like the one bar that we have, or there's a couple of gay bars here, but there's one gay bar in particular where like it's just trashy. Like if a woman walks in there, people give her a side eye. Like you can smoke in there. Like it's just like, and the guy who owns it is like 80 years old, and it's like, this is kind of like the last stretch. Like, there's in a couple of years, like there's not going to be like a filthy smoke-filled room where there's just like porn playing like on the screen, and like, it's, the gays have won, but at what cost? I suppose it's I think a lot of people give too much credit to activism, and that's not to disparage anything that anybody did, and a lot of the activism was like really necessary, especially like when you're talking about like the AIDS crisis and all that. But people who still think that there's room for queer radicalism in the West have to come to terms with the fact that like you are rebelling against a set of like gender expectations that existed in a society that is gone. Like deindustrialization, has, the let me say that again. Like the gendered like expectations that arose like out of like industrial capitalism are gone. And now we're in this weird era where like you don't even really know like what does it mean to be a man? Like that used to be like a very clear answer, of which like having sex with women was one, like with women was one aspect of it. That's why being gay was like shocking and like dangerous to people, is because you were like breaking that expectation of what it meant to be a man. But now like being a man doesn't mean anything, because you don't need to be a man to do any particular job. Like everybody's just working in the service sector, and like masculinity doesn't mean anything.
I suppose following on from that, then what happens to the twink revolution when the twinks age?
Becomes a post-twink revolution.
I guess that makes perfect sense. Alex, you wanted to come in?
No, I mean, the thing that actually struck me, River, hearing that you talk about, gay bars, is that actually that is a process of gentrification, which has kind of happened, in all major cities, to not just gay bars, right? To kind of the social scene as a whole, to kind of probably loads of subcultures as well, which either don't exist anymore or also become gentrified. And so all these kind of outside spaces, which are a little bit more, not lawless necessarily, but kind of not subject to all the kind of formal and informal regulations which kind of control and determine our lives. That it's kind of happened all over the place. So I guess my question, I guess, is how much of this is a general story, or how much of it is something specific within gay culture and indeed like gay politics, that kind of gentrification process has happened?
Well, I mean, there is like you said, like a gentrifying process that's spreading throughout everything and just sort of smoothing out the edges of all culture. That's why culture is so bad now. But I think that there is like something particular going on like within the gay community, and a lot of it is coming from like gay people themselves. Like I wrote an article called "The Woke Resurrection of a Gay Sex Panic," which is was talking about the Alex Morse allegations, where a college student was basically saying that this guy who was running for Congress in Massachusetts had sexually harassed him by like saying like, "Hi, how are you?" like on like Grindr or something. Because he was the mayor, and it was like power dynamics and whatever. And I also talked about, people calling Glenn Greenwald a pedophile because when he met his now husband was like 19 at the time and Brazilian and poor. And so the power dynamics and blah, blah, blah. And, I mean, I think a lot of that is just like the professional class sort of HR mindset that is, I think, particularly pronounced at times in the gay community, because like generally speaking, at least in the US, like more likely to go to college. And, it's a more sort of, those are like the loudest voices in the room and every sort of subculture or like group of people, I guess. But there's just so many of them in the gay world, and they, it's the same type of person that produces like or the same type of system that produces like a Pete Buttigieg is, that sort of idea that, you are gay in the sense that you like date men, but that's where it stops. And like, you still have to like, follow all the like you have to pretend like you're at work all the time, basically. And like everything has to be like very professional and like sanitized. And
I think that's
no,
good.
you're right. I mean, you're right. The part about being at work all the time, I think, is absolutely right.
Yeah.
And being gay used to be a way, or in effect, a way of bunking off, because
That's right, yeah.
because the normal rules didn't apply. And that was part of the appeal of the gay world, is that it had a kind of honesty and a kind of directness to it, and a humor to it, which isn't possible in the HR environment that you're talking about, River.
And I got a question. I mean, because I really don't know, but wasn't there an extent to which also the gay world lent a certain raucousness or whatever to the straight world itself? I mean, at least in kind of alternative culture, but alternative culture which wasn't kind of self-identified as gay, and that now that the ending of that kind of both of kind of gay liberation as a political movement, but more specifically at a kind of cultural level, that the ending of that also has an effect on, kind of mainstream culture, or maybe not mainstream culture.
Have you got a particular example in mind? Like, what are you talking about?
Nothing specific. I guess that's why I asked the question. I mean, just the way that that there was a confluence between kind of general alternative culture and gay culture.
Well, I mean, pretty much the entire output of Andy, what's his name? The artist.
Warhol.
Warhol.
That's the one. You can edit that out and make me sound knowledgeable. That crossover in the 70s, 60s, and 70s of gay culture and gay street culture, which made the name of various personalities, Warhol being one of them, isn't really possible now. Because there's nothing to cross over. The crossover has already happened, and part of the effect of that is that, on the one hand, there isn't really. I mean, I feel completely ambivalent about this, because I've lived too long, and I've lived through this transformation from I arrived on the gay scene, if you call it that, in the early 80s in London, and I've seen the transformations and the victories, as Phil described them, gays winning. And on the one hand, I'll tell you this, that the gay pubs in London in the 80s, with their drag acts and their high energy, full of smoke, they were awful. Or a lot of the time I felt that they were awful because I felt I was sentenced to them. And because I didn't drink, because I was driving, and because I was uptight. But there was a camaraderie, and some of the drag acts, one or two of them were really good. And the drag, whatever the drag act was, usually it depended on them being brutally honest.
Yeah.
And this kind of honesty and directness and vulgarity is not really possible anymore for gays or for anybody else.
That's right.
And yes, and gays are often, as I think River suggested, are often the ones policing this most vigorously these days.
I mean, like, I was just going to say, to the point of like culture and like straight culture. I mean, there was like a kind of a point, I felt at various points, where sort of gay or like queer culture, whatever you want to call it, was kind of like became gradually like started the margin, then became like the mainstream. And it was done in like a very like campy way that you probably couldn't do anymore. Like, I mean, if you think about like something like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which used to be kind of like a French thing, but now everybody knows that movie, everybody's seen it. But I mean, imagine if that movie was made today, a straight guy playing like a murderous transvestite with like a cannibal, and like it's a musical, like people would lose their minds, and it would be gay people losing their minds.
Yeah, that's right.
And but and it's I don't think that like there's like a weird infantilization I think that comes along with that or maybe it's a paranoia, I don't know, but like from certain groups of people, and it's not just like gay men or lesbians or anybody, it's like trans people too, who think that like anything less than like perfect representation, but by which they mean their life exactly, like their individual life exactly, of like what it means to be gay or trans or whatever, is like harmful and like is going to make straight people like hate you or like want to hate crime you or whatever. And it's just like not true. And that's why like I think a lot of like the sort of camp kind of like casual, like, you know, in the 80s where rockers would just like cross dress for like no reason, or like in like the punk scene, same thing. You know, all of that now, like in order to be like a punk guy, like wearing a dress on stage, you would have to be like, oh, I'm non-binary. This is an expression of my identity and or whatever, instead of just being like, I'm doing this because fuck it. Which was way more cool and honest.
Yes.
But
so I wanted to maybe take the opportunity to turn more directly to the history of gay liberation and to the kind of more political aspects, because, well, firstly, would you be able to identify a moment, Mark, when this pivoted from being a universal cause of sexual liberation, basically getting the state out of people's bedrooms, fighting for equality and rights, to something that it's become now that everybody I think would identify as pleading for tolerance and respectability? Or maybe this kind of search for this moment maybe is the wrong way to go about it. But also, Mark, I mean, in doing so, I mean, in responding to my question, I wonder if you could also sketch out maybe what the difference was, or maybe give us some examples of what the difference was between what gay liberation meant, not even just for gays, but in a kind of vision of society, versus what we have today, or what's understood as gay politics today.
As a sort of sideways way of answering that question, I'll say that in anti-gay, in my contribution, one of my contributions, I satirize the idea of Stonewall as this magical moment when all the homosexuals in New York turned into out and proud gays. And you know, how pre-Stonewall, homosexuals were sad, martini drinking, Judy Garland worshipping, self-oppressed, self-loathing, sad creatures. And then after Stonewall, on that night, you know, they're all magically transformed into proud, fierce fighters for gay liberation and gay pride. And I called it the Stonewall Revolution, satirically. But of course, now it's officially designated the Stonewall Insurrection.
Yeah.
And as we get further and further away, both from that perfectly good bar riot, which they're now trying to spoil by calling an insurrection, as we get further and further away from that night and whatever, you know, went down that evening and what it symbolized, and as we have definitely got further and further away from the kind of politics that gay liberation came out of, you know, that 60s Black Power, and also the kind of Marxist background of a lot of these movements. You know, gay pride, the concept of gay pride, I believe, I may be wrong, I'm not the historian of this, was copying or inspired by the idea of black is beautiful. So, you know, there is an identity politics and you know, women's politics as well, feminism in the 60s, all fed into gay liberation. But gay liberationists were radicals. Many of them were Marxist or revolutionaries. They were very often utopian. A lot of them wanted to and did live in communes, gay communes, and some of them ended up at Switchboard. Were still there at Switchboard in the 80s when I briefly worked there as a volunteer, and of course that was all going to be completely steamrolled. Whatever was left of that was going to be completely steamrolled by the 80s. Thatcherism, lifestyleism. AIDS kept that sort of gay politics going a little bit longer, the idea of activism and being under siege and being under attack. But really, the whole process of lifestyleism, consumerism in the 80s was having a profound effect. And in fact, I would say that probably this is just a purely anecdotal, prejudicial guesstimate here, but I would say that probably most gays were Thatcherites in the 80s. And that's a heretical thing to say.
Thatcherite in what sense?
They were aspirational.
Right, yeah.
They weren't necessarily Thatcherite in all the senses of the word, but Thatcherism definitely spoke to them.
Yeah.
Unless they were from, even for some of the people, gay or lesbian, but particularly gay men, who were from deindustrialized, destroyed parts of the country, who had run away to London, and they had this background. Their parents were working class and were very labor and trade union. Some of them, associated all of that with intolerance and the world that they wanted to escape from.
But I think it's also, it speaks also to that kind of aspect of Thatcherism as well. So there was the kind of the Victorian values and the kind of buttoned up conservatism, but there was also an aspect of it that was kind of, like you say, a revolt against the dour world of the Labour Party, the working men's clubs, and the trade unions as well.
Yes, the 1970s, the 70s of collectivism, collective bargaining, of Terry and June, of this for queer kids. The 70s was very often kind of suffocating because it was very, very traditional heterosexual. You had your camp comics and all the rest of it, but it was collectivism and communitarianism, particularly in that era, were very traditional and very heterosexual.
So that goes to, I guess, a follow-up question, just a quick one, but would you say most gays are Thatcherite today still?
Difficult to say. It's kind of in as much as Thatcherism. Well, we're all Blairites now, apparently. So, and Blair was the heir to Thatcher. Yeah. I would definitely say that many Blairites were Thatcherites. Definitely many, and particularly gay Blairites. There was no doubt in my mind that part of the appeal of Blair was precisely his drag queen kind of persona.
What's the drag queen persona of Blair?
That smile. You must remember the 90s. He had this and the eyes, and it was a kind of glamorous, but because he was channeling Thatcher to some degree, and he did have a drag queen kind of charisma to him, which he didn't have any of the ribald humor,
or indeed the honesty.
Exactly, yeah, quite the opposite. But he had a kind of glamorousness to him, which was unsettling, but fascinating. And I think that aspirationalism, which the Tories in the 80s made their own, they captured that concept, was definitely appealing to lots and lots of queer people. I mean, I say queer people, but again, I've lived too long. Queer, it's coming back into vogue, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think with a different meaning, perhaps.
But of a different meaning to the vogue that it had in the 90s, and then of course back in the sort of mid 20th century, it had a slightly different meaning. But it makes perfect sense that kids who aren't heterosexual, or young people who aren't heterosexual, who are born in a very traditional environment, will find aspirationalism very appealing, and also and lifestyleism. Thatcherism was a contradictory, paradoxical project. It was extremely modernizing, to use pseudo-objective language, and liberalizing economically. But of course, she had to, or she and her people, the Tory party had to sell it as being back to Victorian values.
Yeah.
But it absolutely wasn't Victorian values. There was a campaign. I mean, and gays were at the centre of it. Thatcher, the only thing that she ever said about gays was that famous or infamous speech in the 80s, where I think it was the late 80s, mid-late 80s, where she's talking about Section 28, which was a tabloid campaign that the Tory party appropriated for entirely political purposes, because it was a popular campaign against gay propaganda in classes, but also because it was a very useful way for Thatcherism to present itself as being pro-family, pro-traditional values, etc. But it wasn't.
So let me bring in River to address this question of queer. So how do you understand the meaning of queer today, River?
Oh, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, it doesn't, it could, I can just go through my Twitter mentions, because these are the people who get angriest at me. And just, it ranges from straight boys who paint their nails, NYU art girls, effeminate gay men, butch lesbians. It can mean anything. And I guess I've had people been oh, well, that's actually liberating. And I'm okay, maybe, but it's not useful, because I've actually talked to guys who identify as queer, and they're yeah, I've never really done anything. I've never really been with guys. I don't really know if it's my thing or not. I'm well, why are you wasting my time? You know what I mean? I mean, the term gay or even bisexual is useful, at least, because it signifies what your sort of social role is, and whether or not we have a very fundamental thing in common. If I'm trying to hit you up on at a bar or whatever, it's it really I think is probably going to go away. I see it as, it seems kind of faddish to me, because we've seen cycles of this. I mean, it didn't really happen that much where I was growing up, because I lived in a really conservative area, and this was the height of the gay culture war, sort of. But I mean, there was a whole early 2010s thing where everyone on Tumblr was identifying as bisexual, and most of these people are just in totally conventional heterosexual relationships. Now I think you're probably going to see a similar thing with the queer thing, and probably the non-binary thing as well, because, there's plenty of people out there. Like I remember when I first encountered the non-binary term, I was probably like 19, and like the people who I saw it was usually like sort of more butch lesbians, but of the like poetry recital at a coffee shop variety, like the hipstery sort of kind, and like kind of androgynous looking young sort of feminine gay men. And now it's just like anything, like even straight people are doing it. It's crazy. And yeah, I think that's probably gonna wither away too, and I'm sure people get mad about me saying that, but I mean,
that's fine. We wouldn't be a Bunga cast episode if it didn't have somebody getting mad about something at some particular point.
Right.
But so, I mean, you're too young, obviously, for the kind of the kind of heroic era, I suppose, of gay liberation, if that's the right term. But would you say you identify with an older politics, River, or is it more that you feel ill at ease with the current state of sexual politics or gay politics?
Well, I mean, I can only really speak to what I know, and what I know is that like everything that I read about like being gay and all the gay activism that I've ever seen, like in person, and all the messaging and stuff within my lifetime has produced this sort of like Pete Buttigieg archetype. Yeah. And I know I don't like that. So I think that the sort of divide that you see in the gay community right now, it's really more of like a class divide disguising itself as like a cultural like a culture war or something.
So what's the class divide?
I think a lot of the more like working class sort of, I will just say gay men, because lesbians aren't really on Twitter that much. You don't see a lot of them, but I know like a lot of gay guys who sort of like see things that as I do, is like, gay people are too uptight now, and like, all of these people with like sort of new identities who seem very conventional are kind of like, I don't know, drowning out sort of the fun aspects and like camp of gay culture with, their sort of PR policing. I think that tends to be more like working class people or older gay men who, it's for whom this is sort of a new thing, and they're not used to like, being, gay being something that could potentially help you get a job because you're applying to a place that has like diversity quotas, at like a nice university or something. Yeah. And so, I think that is probably has something to do with like the sort of squabbles that you're seeing right now, especially online.
Yeah. So, River, I think your point earlier about how gayness has been transformed into something that can be used for power. This is this I think raises the question of what demands could there be that could be really emancipatory. We've heard the claim on the left, and including by some previous guests we've had on the podcast, that the left took a wrong turn when it pitched into sexual liberation and campaigned to emancipate a multitude of oppressed sexual identities. I guess the question then is like, is there anything left to fight for in the cause of sexual freedom? Is there anything that can be because I think some of the tone of the discussions maybe been quite negative. It maybe justifiably so, but is there anything that in this area can be the nucleus of a really emancipatory, liberatory politics?
No, I don't think so. I don't think. Sorry, I don't think that there's anything left to. I mean, the only fighting that's going to be happening is fighting between gay people about how much we're, going to get mad at each other, and how, what aspects of gay culture and like these sort of hedonistic aspects of which are like going to be retained, and how much of it is going to be like this, like HR diversity quota thing or whatever, where you're like fighting with like a bisexual woman for like an associate professorship at NYU or whatever, and trying to figure out who's more oppressed. Like that's where the battle is. I don't even think that. I think the left, maybe in like the 60s and 70s, by like attaching itself to like these sort of cultural battles, alienated working class people. But now, like, I mean, like I said, Matt Gaetz is my congressman. He supports like gay marriage, which, I mean, it's not an issue anymore, so it doesn't really matter. But I mean, he's one of the most conservative Republicans in the House, and it's like nobody really cares anymore about gay people. I think there might be a backlash to like everyone identifying as like some form of queer or whatever, because that seems performative. But I don't even know. I think that it's I think, how do I put it this way? I think that like if you keep it simple and just say like, okay, well, we want to retain what we have, and maybe in a universal healthcare program or whatever, trans people get included. That's really all you have to do that would materially like help any person. And so you really don't need to say any more than that. I think maybe overemphasizing it could alienate some people, just because, not because they even have anything against this sort of thing, but they're just like, okay, well, I don't even know what aromantic means, or is one of these people need to be protected, or because they're like, they're like, okay, well, this doesn't help me because I'm straight or whatever.
So that's, I guess. Yeah. So, Mark, if River's take is essentially the HRification of gayness, and is there anything left after gay marriage? I mean, do you have anything to leave our listeners on a more less doom-filled note?
You called the wrong guy. Well, I abandoned what little hope I had left. I mean, anti-gay was a suicide note anyway to gay politics for me, and gay identity. Identity politics is a terrible vehicle for sexuality, because all you end up with is identity politics and no sexuality. And that's what happened with gay marriage. Because gay marriage is about, the whole gay marriage thing, it's when it happened, the demands for it in America were bad enough. And thanks to social media, of course, which has by that time had begun to really kick off, it was all imported into the UK. And I thought in a extremely chauvinistic fashion that because we had civil partnerships already in the UK, that we wouldn't have any time for this culture war, this completely bogus culture war, which is what it was in the British context. Because let me just point something out very quickly. Gay marriage, or same-sex marriage, as it's technically called, is civil partnerships with just a couple of tweaks. It isn't the same as heterosexual marriage legally, and thank fuck for that, because the two tests of heterosexual marriage are consummation. These are actual legal tests: consummation and adultery. And neither of these, they tried and they tried and they tried, but the civil service lawyers could not find a way of applying these tests to same-sex couples, same-sex relationships. So they are not included in the Same-Sex Marriage Act, and gay marriage is not marriage. It's a lie. Why? Because everybody wanted a piece of this culture war, and turning gayness into an identity and into respectability. And it was a Tory prime minister who introduced the whole concept. There wasn't a groundswell for it until he pushed the idea. Decided that it would be a good way of rebranding the Tory party, away from being the nasty party to being the nice Metropolitan party. And it was very successful. And that's what the point of it was. So
it
that
worked.
it worked. And it worked on every level, including, making homosexuality respectable. And this was the, people who got very worked up in the UK about gay marriage did it performatively online on social media, which is what you do nowadays. And once, when that happened, when all of that happened, I realized that there was no substantial difference between us and the US anymore, and that identity politics had swallowed everything. Most particularly, it has swallowed sexuality, and sex into identity doesn't go. And no matter how many letters you stick on the end of the latest banner, it still doesn't fit. And in fact, the more letters you put on, the less it fits. And I would say, however, that my only optimism about the future, well, perhaps not my only optimism, but one possible optimism about the future, is about people that probably nobody cares about very much except me, which is just very quickly, the Wolfenden report that decriminalized homosexuality, male homosexuality, or partially decriminalized it in 1967 in the UK, was based on the distinction between inborn inverts, homosexuals, and perverts. And perverts were otherwise heterosexual men who took part in same-sex sex. And the Wolfenden report was passed in Parliament on the basis that you need to crack down on the perverts and leave the inverts, the born homosexuals, alone. And in fact, the grounds for this, the plea for this that was made repeatedly was exactly that in the same terms as gay marriage was to be made much later, which was that they just, to be that all that a born invert homosexual really wants is total domestic privacy and bourgeois bliss. And that's what it was passed on the basis of. So the so-called perverts, who are the otherwise heterosexual men that the Wolfenden report cracked down on, and the police cracked down on, because cottaging arrests went up something like 10 times after the decriminalization of homosexuality, so-called. I think that in this brave new online world, whoops, sorry, knocked something over there, that this subsector, if you like, which is actually much larger than the so-called born that way brigade, whether or not you believe that homosexuality is inborn or not, that is because of the decline in the taboo and the prejudice against homosexuals, gay people, there is more of that other stuff going on now, which there was lots of going on before the post-war period, which is why I mentioned that YouTube clip, that YouTube documentary about gay life in the 1930s and all the trade that was going on back then, because that was before homosexuality became an identity. Instead, what mattered, I don't mean to romanticize that period, but what mattered then was gender style rather than an identity. It wasn't until the work of the sexologists really took root in the sort of 1950s that the idea of the homosexual as a separate species was established in the public mind and in the mind of homosexuals. And Foucault, who is an ambiguous figure, nevertheless made the salient observation that the sexologists and the categorization of sexuality and perversions actually, because it particularly came down to this idea of inborn homosexuality, basically produced the modern gay identity. It's based on a sexological perverse category.
Well, that's brilliant, Mark, Simpson, and Riverpage. Thank you both very much. Down with boxes and down with the sexual bureaucracy. That's it for Bunga Bunga but Gay this time. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.
I saw a NATO ad, like a NATO University ad today. It was the dark thing I've ever seen in my life.
Yes.
Yeah, it's. I mean, all of that stuff. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know how mainstream it is in the US, but in the UK, like it's. I mean, the police station. Very amusingly, a friend tweeted he was going for his kind of walk in lockdown, and he tweeted a photo of Pentonville Prison, which is where Oscar Wilde was imprisoned in the 19th century, running up the gay flag. It's just completely bizarre.
Yeah. It's grotesque is the word, really.
Yes, absolutely.
But yeah, the NATO ad, we are all different. We are Borg.
No, that's right. It's completely strange.
Yes, well, everybody wants to be special now,
yeah,
but nobody is.
Yeah,
and that's the problem that gays face, in a nutshell.
And that's and that I think also partly drives the all the kind of aromantic, asexual, new identity stuff as well, non-binary. Like
you get to be an entrepreneur and come up with an ever more newer ways to make yourself special.
Yes,
we all want to be.
Yeah, well, I think it might have something to do with like the way that, well, one, elite overproduction, but two, like the way things have been going in academia lately, because like a lot of the things that people are describing and like creating into new identities, like the aromantic thing, or, where it's just like, oh, well, you don't want a relationship or whatever, but then they'll be like, oh, well, it exists on a spectrum. I'm like, so sometimes you want a relationship, and sometimes you just want to hook up.
You're a normal person.
Yeah, you're a normal person. And I think like it's just like people are like, okay, it's just some grad student who has to write a thesis in like 3 months, and they're like, okay, well, I'm gonna write about this very specific thing that's going on in my life right now, and make it into a
whole new identity, with a whole new social theory to go with it.
There'll be a new identity that's like gay for the stay or something, and that's what they'll be flying over Oscar Wilde's prison next.